place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations. And
the U.S. says Venezuela is too dangerous for Americans to visit, but now it's sending Venezuelan families back there anyway. Senator Cory Booker is calling out what he says is pure hypocrisy, warning that ending protections could make the United States complicit in serious human rights abuses.
This is the hypocrisy that I see. At the same time that you're issuing these human rights cautions about what's going on there for Americans, you have a president that's lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans. Many of them are individuals that have lived in our country for years, if not decades. When I hear from the Venezuelan community, I hear an outrage that at the very same time that you are affirming here that these armed militias are running around suppressing voices, we have an administration that has said very clearly that they're not only going to be lifting temporary protected status for Venezuelans living in the U.S., but instead of protecting longtime American residents, they are, quote, the administration is putting people back on deportation flights and sending them into that madness. Does that make sense to you?
Well, first of all, the travel advisories for American citizens traveling there and the threats posed to Americans. What you're describing
why lift temporary protected status?
Well, the problem with temporary protective status was it was granted to so many people in such a vast numbers so quickly without proper vetting by the previous administration that there's a real concern that there were gang members that had received TPS simply because of the nation they came from and the time in which they came. It became so big and so massive. The overwhelming majority of Venezuelans are not members of Trained at Agua, but there were Trained at Agua and other criminal elements embedded in the TPS system. And the numbers were so large that the administration felt it had to cancel the program in order to appropriately vet it through on the individual cases.
Excuse me, Mr. Secretary, this might not surprise you. I don't trust this administration and the way they use terms like terrorist. I've seen them calling American citizens domestic terrorists who are people trying to peacefully protest. The problem we have right now is the administration continues to make policies that seem to contradict their words, and yet we don't have a process in place for Congress to do its job because people are not calling folks in for these hearings and not providing the kind of oversight that we need. It is very frustrating to me that we still have a repressive regime in power in Venezuela suppressing human rights, yet we are cooperating with them, we are funding them, and we're not calling out the ridiculousness of the violence that's going on there. At the same time, we're taking people who have lived in our country for years and years and years and sending them back into that hell where they can be targeted, where they can be abducted, where they can be held for hostage because they know they have American family members that are still here. This is a situation ripe for where we are being complicit in continuing human rights violations. And
what Senator Booker is pressing on here goes far beyond a single immigration policy. He's calling out what he sees as a moral and legal contradiction at the heart of U.S. foreign and domestic policy toward Venezuela. On one hand, the U.S. government issues stark warnings to Americans, describing Venezuela as a place plagued by repression, armed militias, arbitrary detention, and systemic human rights abuses. On the other hand, that same government is ending temporary protected status for Venezuelans who have lived in the United States for years, sometimes decades, and forcing many of them back into the very conditions the U.S. itself has deemed dangerous. To understand why this matters, it helps to be clear about what TPS actually is. Temporary protected status is not a loophole or a handout. It's a legal designation created by Congress that allows people from countries experiencing war, natural disasters, or extraordinary instability to live and work in the U.S. because returning them would put their lives at risk. Venezuelans were granted TPS precisely because their country has collapsed politically and economically, with widespread reports of persecution, violence, and disappearances under a repressive regime. Booker's core argument is about hypocrisy and responsibility. If the U.S. acknowledges that Venezuela is unsafe for its own citizens to visit, how can it justify deporting people who have built families, careers, and communities here back into that same danger? He's also highlighting the real-world consequences of these decisions. Deportees aren't just returning to hardship. Many face heightened risk because they're seen as having American ties. That can make them targets for extortion, kidnapping, or retaliation by criminal groups or state-linked actors. The administration's defense rests on concerns about vetting and public safety, arguing that TPS was expanded too quickly and may have allowed some criminal elements to slip through. Booker pushes back hard on this, warning against broad-brush policies that punish entire communities for the actions of a few. His distrust is rooted in how terms like gang member or terrorist have been used loosely in the past, sometimes to justify sweeping actions that later prove unjust or unlawful. From his perspective, canceling TPS wholesale doesn't fix vetting failures. It simply creates new human rights risks. There's also a deeper oversight issue at play. Booker is frustrated, not just with the policy outcome, but with the process. He's arguing that Congress is being sidelined, that meaningful oversight isn't happening, and that life-altering decisions are being made without transparency or accountability. When the U.S. cooperates with or financially engages regimes it simultaneously condemns, while deporting vulnerable people into harm's way, it risks becoming complicit in the abuses it claims to oppose. At its core, this exchange forces a hard question. Does U.S. policy prioritize consistency, human rights, and the rule of law, or political expediency? Booker's warning is clear. When words and actions don't match, the cost isn't abstract. It's paid by real people sent back into danger, and by a country that undermines its own credibility on human rights. If you want more breakdowns like this that go beyond the sound bites and actually explain what these confrontations mean, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps keep these issues in the spotlight.